Printer's Devil. Sam Clemens was 11 years old when the happy round of swimming adventures, cave exploration, boating and fishing trips on the big Mississippi, school picnics, and church social ended. In 1847, the judge died. Judge Clemens died just as the moment when, for that first time in years, the family felt fortune was about at last to smile on them. All his life, the judge, like his sons later, had no head for business. His worst fault was that he was always trusting the wrong people. A rascally real estate operator let the judge stand security for good deal of money. For years, Judge Clemens had made himself and his family practically paupers trying to make good on the money. The year of 1847 had started, however, with high hopes. Judge Clemens was to take over the clerkship of the circuit court. This would mean the family was assured of a steady income. At the end of February, on a trip to Palmyra, the county seat where he went to be sworn in, he caught cold in a bad storm. The cold grew worse. Pleurisy followed. Not even the just indomitable will could stop and ravages of the disease. He died on March 24th. The family finances, which had never been good, now became disastrous. The shock to young Sam Clemens was great. He thought of his own behavior. He thought of the things his father had tried to teach him. He felt that he had failed his father, and he was filled with a grief that was intensified by his own sense of guilt. His mother tried to reassure him, telling him that boys could not be expected to fulfill the duties of men, but Sam could not be consoled. When his mother asked him to remember the goodness of his father and try to follow that example, he hastily agreed. Day and night he worried that he had not had the high standards his father had expected of him. He remembered all the times he had played hookery. He thought of his pranks, harmless enough, boyish pranks, but still a source of annoyance to his mother and father. He told himself that whatever else happened, he would honor his father's dying request. On his deathbed, Judge Clemens had told the family to cling to the land and wait. Let nothing beguile it away from you. The land he was speaking of was the 70,000 acres remaining of the huge tract of land in Tennessee, which all his life the judge had believed would someday make the family rich. The land was good for nothing save potatoes, pine, and grass, but through all his troubles, starting from the time he had been wiped out in the great financial crash in 1834, the judge had gone on thinking that the Tennessee land would be his salvation. The judge's dream was the dream of a Virginia gentleman. In the South, there was no shame in being land poor and pride rich. So long as there was land, there was an inheritance, and the judge had stressed this all his life to his sons. On his death bed, he still spoke of it. Even at the age of 11, Sam had doubts about the land, but Orion, the oldest son, felt as his father did. Orion was strange boy, one of those people on whom fortune seems to frown. He was pious and somewhat priggish, and he certainly was mystery to his fond-loving mother. Jenny Clemens never understood him, and later in Sam's life, Orion became as much of a puzzle to him as he had been to their mother. Orion never seemed able to hold a job. When he did have one, he always managed to lose money. In trying to explain his perplexing brother, Sam Clemens later wrote, one of his characteristics was eagerness. He woke with an eagerness about some matter and other. Every morning it consumed him all day. It perished in the night, and he was on fire with a fresh new interest next morning before he could get his clothes on. Orion was subject to tremendous shifts in interest. He would go from the heights of happiness to the depth of despair, and the shifts were sudden and unexpected. He acted on impulse, unable to settle down to thoughtful planning, always running off in a new direction after wolves. He had no sense of proportion. Everything was of equal value of him. He was the kind of person of whom we say he has not learned to put first things first. Henry, the youngest boy in the family, was a gentle, good boy whose goodness was so natural that it seems never to have occurred to him to misbehave. Henry was the model for Sid in Sam's book, Tom Sawyer. Though Sam was to point out that Henry was a very finer and better boy than ever Sid was. Henry was everybody's favorite, and certainly Sam loved him like no one else in the family, but Henry could not help exasperating him. Henry was so good, and Sam, was constantly in so much trouble. Although the family was in desperate straits, all of them agreed not to sell the Tennessee land. Even years later, when Sam wanted to sell, he felt a twinge of conscience. At last, when he did have an opportunity to sell the land to a man who wanted to grow grapes for wine, Orion refused to sign for his share. At that time, Orion had taken up a new cause. He was now fervent teetotaler, although only a few months before he had actively campaigned against laws prohibiting drinking. The dream of the Tennessee land never came true. 40 years after the judge's death, there were no more than 10,000 acres left, the rest having gone in small sales here and there, and no one ever made more than a couple of $100 from the property. It put our energies to sleep, Sam Clemens said in later years, and made visionaries of us, dreamers and indolent. We were always going to be rich next year. After the judge's death, the family was poverty stricken. Orion went to work as a printer in St. Louis, sent as much of his wages home as possible. Pamela taught piano. Sam had a job delivering the Hannibal Gazette. Jenny Clemens, the mother, took in boarders. Much as Jenny Clemens wanted to keep Sam in school, she could not. The family finances were just too bad. Sam at 12 became a printer's apprentice for a man named Ament. Mr. Ament could not give the boy a real salary because in those days no one paid cash for newspapers. The subscriptions were paid for in sugar, coffee, wood, dry goods, pumpkins, melons, turnips, onions. The terms of Sam's contract were room and board and 2 suits of clothes a year. Sam's chores included building the morning fire, getting water from the town well, sweeping out the printing establishment, sorting type, hand setting the type, and turning the press by hand. He folded and wrapped papers, and every Thursday he got up at the crack of dawn to deliver them to the town's 100 subscribers. Sam's mother saw how unhappy he was at the job, but there was nothing she could do. Jenny Clemens was having a hard time making ends meet, and one less mouth to feed was an important consideration. Sam's first suit of clothes were Mr. Ament's hand me down so big that they made Sam look as if he were in full sail when he came down the street. Nor did he ever see his second suite of hand-me-downs. The Aments were forgetful about that. At the Aments, Sam slept on the floor in the printing shop. At first, he was made to eat in the kitchen, but eventually he was allowed at the dining room table. The food turned out to be stew, made mostly of the potatoes and endless boiled cabbage. One slice of bread per meal, which Mrs. Ammon took the precaution of cutting thinly and putting at each plate. There was also watery coffee and 1 spoonful of brown sugar per cup, which Mrs. Ammon also took the precaution of measuring out. For those who liked white coffee, Mrs. Ammon carefully measured out 1 teaspoon of condensed milk. Sam was bothered day and night by hunger and felt no compunction about raiding the storeroom of onions and potatoes, which he and the other apprentice cooked over the stove in the printing shop. In 1849 or 1850, Orion bought the Hannibal Journal on borrowed capital and goodwill. Orion promised Sam wages of $3.50 a week, but there was never was never any money to pay him. However, when Orion was away, Sam got some entertainment for himself by writing sprightly, humorous articles, mostly spoof of local conditions and characters, and interesting them in the paper. The state Orion disapproved of these pieces, but there was nothing he could do about them after they had already appeared. At 16, Sam had his first story published in a Boston Weekly, The Carpetbag. It was called The Dandy Frightening the Squatter, and it appeared under the initial SLC. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, alas, received no money for the piece and had to be content with the honor and with his hand-me-down clothes and his wageless work. Exciting things were happening all around for the paper to report. Hannibal now possessed a telegraph machine which speeded up the flow of news from the outside world. Big events were happening everywhere. The war with Mexico ended. Then there was news of the discovery of gold in California. Nobody could talk of anything else. Then suddenly a new epidemic started. Cholera struck town after town. One steamboat after another unloaded its frightful cargo. Passengers who had died on the board. On passengers who had died on board. Then the word gold was heard again. The gold rush was no dream. Every day men were making fortunes out in California. Wagons flocked through Hannibal, following the old Santa Fe Trail out toward Sacramento and the New Wealth. Sam would stand by the wagons listening to the men talk, looking at the picks and shovels, the barrels and the boxes of provisions, wishing with all his heart he could go with them. He had caught the gold fever too. He bemoaned his fate that he was too young to join the wagon's trains. Everyone agreed there were fabulous riches to be garnered in the West. Few spoke about the suffering and tragedies that sometimes occurred. No one talked of Indian attacks and of deaths caused by disease, starvation, and thirst. Instead, people talked about gold, about striking it rich, about California coming into the Union. But Sam knew he had responsibilities at home. He had to stand by and watch the men go. He talked to them and reported what he heard and sadly watched them off, wishing in his heart that he were part of the excitement and adventure. In his few leisure hours, young Sam Clemens read everything he could get his hands on. One of the most exciting books was an account of an exploration of the Amazon. Sam thrilled to the tales of that far off mysterious place, and he made up his mind that one day he would go to explore that other mighty river. He might not be able to go prospecting for gold in California, but he could go to the Amazon and perhaps explore the undiscovered part of the river about the headwaters. The headwaters were said to be 4,000 miles from the mouth of the Amazon, and no man had ever been there, no white man at least. But he needed money, lots of money, for such an expedition, and the Clemens household was always short of the commodity. He was not earning anything, and the paper under Orion's fretful management was not likely ever to make a fortune, not with the kind of articles Orion liked to print. Whenever Sam could get some of his own pieces published, the subscribers all praised the writing, but Orion said it was not staid and respectable enough. Sam read avidly about the famous World's Fair in New York. One article stated that 5,000 people came every day to see the new Crystal Palace. Sam could not believe it. Why, that was more people by far than Hannibal had. He determined to find out what the world was like outside to Hannibal. He decided to go to New York, and after New York, the Amazon, he told himself. At the age of 18, Sam set out. He went by steamship to St. Louis, where he worked for evening news as a typesetter, hoping to make enough money to go on to New York. Young Sam Clemens worked 2 months in St. Louis. Then he set out for the big city with $3 in change and $10 bill in his pocket. New York fascinated the boy who had lived in a small Mississippi River town all his life. He could not get over the elegant restaurants, the beautiful clothes, the astonishing sights. He went immediately to the Crystal Palace Fair. It cost 50 cents to enter, but it was the best $half Sam had ever spent. It made his head spin to see all the fabulous sights. He went to the Croton Reservoir at what was then the northern boundary of the city, 5th Avenue, 42nd Street, but which is now the heart of the city and the site of the New York Public Library. He marveled at the huge buildings with their ornate trimmings. He even saw real theater, thrilling to the great actor Edwin Forrest's performance in The Gladiator. But his money was quickly gone and he had to find another printing job. He worked in the city for a time, grew restless, then moved on Philadelphia, where he worked for various newspapers as a printer. Sam was fascinated by Philadelphia just as he had been overwhelmed by New York. Here he was seeing much of American history at first. One after another, he toured the Philadelphia museums and galleries, the libraries and historic places. He saw the grave of Benjamin Franklin and the State House where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. He loved to go down to the harbor which linked Philadelphia to the trade routes of the Atlantic. Whenever he felt homesick for Hannibal, he would walk along the wharves of Philadelphia. As he looked down the bay, he longed to start on his exploration of the Amazon, but he was still very young and struggling along in a printing office with little hope of saving all the money he needed, at least not for years. He probably would have stayed in the East if Orion had not ventured on a new scheme in which he needed help. Orion had sold the Hannibal Journal and moved to Muscatine, Iowa. There he had started a new paper, the Muscatine Journal. Now he needed help, and Sam answered the call, making the trip back to his brother on the train, sitting up for the 3 days and 3 nights to get there. Orion had married, and the newspaper would barely support Orion and his wife, let alone Jenny Clemens, Henry and Sam. Like Miss Amend, Orion was paid mostly in cabbages, eggs, Cornish, cordwood, vegetables, and an occasional chicken. Orion finally moved Henry and Jenny Clemens to Keokuk and bought a newspaper there. During the winter of 1856-57 in Keokuk, Sam decided once and for all to make his trip to the fabulous Amazon. He knew now that Orion would never make a go of any business venture he got involved in, and Sam wanted to get out and try his own luck. The excitement and mystery of the Amazon were haunting him, and he determined that he, Sam Clemens, would be the one who would go to the headwaters and finish the exploration of one of the world's mightiest rivers. He made his way to Cincinnati and worked until spring, carefully hoarding his money. Then, when the good weather set in, he could no longer resist the call of the adventure. He was ready to take a steamboat to New Orleans and a frigate from New Orleans to South America. And then, who knew,